Iron melts at 1,538 degrees Celsius. No fire built by human hands could reach that temperature for another 2,000 years after people were already making iron tools, which means the entire foundation of the Iron Age was built on a technology that never once melted the metal it was made from. So if the melting point was out of reach, what were ancient blacksmiths actually doing? Not casting, not pouring liquid metal into a mold the way bronze workers had for 1,000 years already. Something stranger, and honestly, something closer to hammering than to smelting in the way we usually picture it. By the time anyone tried to work iron seriously, bronze had already solved the metal problem. Bronze is copper mixed with tin, and it is a genuinely good material. Strong, sharp, easy to cast, easy to repair by melting it down and pouring it again. There was just one catastrophic weakness built into it. Tin is rare. Copper turns up in a lot of places, but workable tin deposits sit in only a handful of locations on the planet, and Bronze Age civilizations depended on long, fragile trade routes just to keep their weapons and plows in supply. Iron ore, meanwhile, was almost everywhere. Rust-colored rock sitting in riverbeds and hillsides across nearly every inhabited continent. The problem was never finding it. The problem was that nobody could figure out how to turn rock into a tool. The very first iron humans ever touched did not come out of the ground at all. It fell from the sky. Some meteorites are made of a metallic iron-nickel alloy already in usable metal form. No smelting required, just cold, dense, unusually heavy rock that could be hammered directly into shape. In 2016, researchers led by Diane Johnson at the Open University analyzed an iron dagger buried with Tutankhamun and confirmed, through its nickel content, that the blade had been forged from a meteorite. Ancient Egyptian texts describe iron using a phrase that translates roughly to metal from the sky, and that is not poetry. It is a literal, technical description written by people who understood exactly where the material had come from. For centuries, iron was not a technology. It was a windfall, rare, precious, and entirely outside human control. Turning ordinary ore into iron on purpose required a discovery nobody was looking for. Bronze workers already ran hot charcoal furnaces to smelt copper, and some of them packed iron-rich stone in as a flux, a material added to help slag separate cleanly from the molten metal. Every so often, at the base of a furnace built for copper, a strange, spongy lump would form. Not liquid, not shaped like anything useful, gray and pitted and full of holes. Most furnace operators probably scraped it out and discarded it for generations before someone stopped and hammered it instead of throwing it away. And when they did, that lump behaved like nothing else they had ever worked. It compressed. It held an edge when sharpened. It was iron, formed not by melting, but by a chemical reaction between the ore, the charcoal, and the heat, happening well below iron's actual melting point. This process is called bloomery smelting, and it works nothing like casting bronze. Ore and charcoal are packed into a clay furnace, and air is pumped in through bellows to keep the fire hot enough to strip oxygen away from the iron atoms in the rock, without ever making the metal liquid. What comes out is called a bloom, a rough, solid mass of iron tangled together with leftover slag, closer in texture to a dense sponge than to a finished tool. The only way to make it useful was to reheat it and hammer it, over and over, driving the slag out with each strike and welding the remaining iron fibers into something solid. This is backbreaking, repetitive, physically brutal work, and at first it produced a metal that was, honestly, worse than good bronze. Softer, less predictable, prone to rust in a way bronze never was. But something happened during all that hammering that nobody planned for. Iron worked directly beside a charcoal fire slowly absorbs carbon into its outer surface. Blacksmiths did not know the chemistry behind it. They just noticed that iron worked longer and hotter, and closer to the coals came out harder and held a sharper edge. That accidental carbon uptake was the earliest form of steel, discovered through repetition and observation, not theory, centuries before anyone understood why it worked. Evidence for how early this knowledge actually stretched back keeps getting pushed further into the past. In 2009, archaeologist Hideo Akanuma examined a small fragment of carburized steel recovered from the site of Kamenkalahoyuk in central Turkey, and dated it to roughly 1800 BCE, several centuries before iron was supposed to have mattered to anyone. The fragment did not belong to a king or a temple. It was ordinary debris from an ordinary settlement, evidence that someone, somewhere, had already worked out how to make iron harder through carbon exposure long before the rest of the world had any reason to care. And this is the part of the story that actually explains why iron won. It was not because iron was better than bronze. For a long stretch, it was not. Iron won because of what happened around 1200 BCE, when the trade networks that had kept Bronze Age tin supplies moving across the Mediterranean collapsed, all at once, for reasons historians are still piecing together. Bronze became scarce almost overnight. Iron, difficult and unglamorous as it was sitting in the ground in nearly every region on Earth. Communities that had never controlled a tin route could now make their own tools and weapons locally without depending on anyone. The historian James Mooley, who spent much of his career studying this exact transition, argued that the old idea of a single civilization guarding an iron monopoly does not hold up. Iron smelting was already known in scattered pockets long before the Bronze Age collapsed. What changed was necessity. When bronze failed, the knowledge that had been sitting quietly on the margins suddenly mattered to everyone. Bronze had always belonged to whoever controlled the trade route. A farmer did not own bronze tools. A king's army did, a temple did, a merchant with the right connections did. Iron ore did not care who you were. It sat under the ground near almost every village on Earth, waiting for anyone willing to do the punishing work of digging it out and hammering it into shape. For the first time, a family with no political connections and no access to distant tin mines could own a metal plow, a metal axe, a metal blade. Armies that had once been limited by how much bronze their kingdom could import were suddenly limited only by how much ore their own hills could produce. That shift, quiet and unglamorous as it was, rearranged who had access to power across the entire ancient world. If a story like this, about a supply chain crisis quietly reshaping the entire ancient world, is the kind of thing you find yourself thinking about later, it would mean a lot if you stuck around for the next one. Every steel beam holding up every building you have ever stood inside began as the same reaction. Rock, heat, and enough carbon to change the metal's behavior at a level nobody could see, only feel with a hammer in their hand. The engineers who calculate exactly how much carbon to add to modern steel are running the same chemistry a Bronze Age blacksmith stumbled into by accident, standing too close to his own fire. Nobody sat down and invented iron. Someone scraped a strange lump out of a furnace they were about to throw away and decided to hit it instead. Thank you for watching.